Let me now go to our last audit on the crucial issue of chronic homelessness. In this audit, we looked at whether Employment and Social Development Canada and Infrastructure Canada worked to prevent and reduce chronic homelessness. We also looked at whether the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation contributed to this objective by delivering federal housing programs and services that address the housing needs and improve housing outcomes for vulnerable Canadians, including those who are experiencing chronic homelessness.
Showed that although 5 years have gone by since the launch of the federal government's national housing strategy, there is still no organization in the federal government taking the lead on Canada's target to reduce chronic homelessness by 50% by 2028. In addition, the organizations did not know whether their efforts so far had improved housing outcomes for vulnerable Canadians. For example, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, as the lead for the National Housing Strategy, has spent about half of the roughly $9 billion it committed to the strategy, but it did not know whether those most in need benefited from these initiatives. This was because the corporation did not measure the changes in housing outcomes for priority vulnerable groups, including people experiencing homelessness. Nous avons aussi constaté que
we also found that some rental housing units created under the strategy that the corporation considered affordable were often unaffordable for low-income households and vulnerable groups. In addition, the corporation had not assessed whether those most in need were being housed. One of my biggest concerns is the lack of federal accountability for achieving Canada's target to reduce chronic homelessness by half by 2028. Infrastructure Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation should be coordinating their efforts to deliver on the National Housing Strategy's objectives and get a roof over the heads of individuals and families. Thank you for your attention. I am now ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Christian Noel, Radio-Canada.
Bonjour.
Hello, Auditor General. When we talk about accessing to housing and chronic homelessness, what can you tell families who are on waiting lists, who see that the government isn't capable of offering them anything, or other people are getting access to housing but not them? What can you say to those families or to those individuals? What does this reflect in terms of how the government is managing the situation? What we observed is that the government lacks the information to be able to demonstrate if all of their activities increased or decreased homelessness, especially chronic homelessness. A solution to homelessness is one that should be based on data. And we also observed that there is a lack of coordination between Infrastructure Canada and the CMHC. When they're trying to work on the needs of someone who is experiencing homelessness, it's not just housing they need, but the additional support systems as well. And so these two agencies should work together better to improve the situation. So given this mismanagement of the government, what are you saying to the families on those waiting lists? There are supports that can be accessible to them. There are many groups or communities that receive federal funding, and it should start there. And these supports can help them out, and they can access subsidies. But it is up to the government to make sure that they are taking into account the objective of reducing chronic homelessness by 50% and to make sure that their projects are aligned with this objective. So it's really about time the situation was improved.
Hi there. Yeah, I want to ask you about the homelessness report. If I have this right, essentially Infrastructure Canada and CMHC they don't know if the billions of dollars in public money that they've spent, if it's been effective in actually reducing chronic homelessness. How do they justify that, blatant oversight? What's their excuse to you, and are you buying it?
So what we found is that Infrastructure Canada and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation really have a big data gap. They aren't collecting the information to know if those most in need or those that were targeted by projects were actually being housed in certain affordable housing units. But they also weren't able to demonstrate that all of the activity was either increasing or decreasing homelessness. Some of it is a lack of information. In other instances, it's having information and not reacting or analyzing and doing something with that information. It's a very typical issue that we see on data management, but in the area of addressing homelessness, a data-driven strategy is a great solution. And they really do need to start coordinating their efforts to do that better.
And then on the CMHC program that supports affordable housing and rentals, I guess it's the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. So if I have it right, it is in 8 of the 13 provinces and territories, people are paying in excess of 30% of their before tax income on rent, which does not align with the national housing strategy. Is it your opinion then that this program is a bit of a failure if it's not actually hitting the target the government set for affordable housing?
So this program is at the beginning stages of it, and I do think that it's time that they could adjust the program to put it on a more viable path. We looked at 6 programs that Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation manages in this area, but the one about National Co-Investment Fund is the one that is supposed to develop affordable housing units. And as you mentioned, that would usually mean that it's about 30% of an individual's income that's devoted to rent. Under this fund, CMHC used a different measure of affordability, and they based it on 80% of market rent. So in an environment where rent is going up, that really results in units being very unaffordable for low-income families. That's why we recommended that a better coordination with Infrastructure Canada, but more importantly, someone being accountable for reducing that target of meeting that target of reducing chronic homelessness by 50% is really needed, because these projects can't run in silos. They really do have to complement and support each other, because we estimate it's unlikely that the government will meet its target if it continues down this path.
Moving back into the room, we'll go to Canadian Press. Najud.
Hi there. So when it comes to the homelessness report, you say that this gap in data is common in government. I'm just wondering, is there a concern that across the government there's these ambitious targets and goals, but that there's actually no way of measuring if the government's achieving that? Are you concerned that this is not just about Infrastructure Canada or CMHC, that it's something to do with the way things are managed across the government?
We have this finding in many audits that we do. We had it recently in the Gender-Based Analysis Plus audit, where if you try to identify if certain populations are benefiting from programs, you actually need the data to know whether they are using those programs. And so that data gap is definitely one that my office has identified for a very long time. In this case, it was really, it is an ambitious target of reducing chronic homelessness by 50%, but you need the information to be able to measure where homelessness is when you start, and then whether or not you're actually making a difference. So for example, we saw that Infrastructure Canada had information about changes in usage of shelters, that more families were using shelters than individuals. So we didn't see them seeking to understand why that happened, but then taking the step needed to adjust their programs if necessary. Housing requirements for families are different than housing requirements for individuals.
And so when it comes to this data gap, I know that was one of the recommendations, was to start tracking and analyzing this data. And the federal government agreed, but I'm wondering, is there an opportunity to go backwards and assess what happened between 2019 and 2021, or is this going to be a commitment that has to do with moving forward what they do?
Well, definitely, I hope that they'll do it moving forward. That would be our intention, to be able to see the progress that they're making. But there is information out there about shelter usage that could be gathered, and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation could reach out to the organizations that are building the units to be able to let them know who's actually being housed in them. So there is an opportunity to go back and do that. I would like them to focus in on actually setting up the mechanisms to ensure they have that on a more regular basis going forward. But I think it's a great place to start, be able to measure whether you've actually had some progress in the first few years to be able to adjust as needed.
Just looking at the report on chronic homelessness, and you identify, several groups, among them Indigenous people, and I'm looking also then at the First Nations report, the emergency support, and there are so many cases where they lose their homes and houses to fire, floods, mold, what have you. So there's a homelessness there. Do you draw any connection between sort of the loss of housing and the homelessness in particular for First Nations? I don't know whether, with respect to the homeless situation, whether First Nations occupy kind of a unique problem within Canada that is the same as so many of the other groups, but is also different.
Mm-hmm. So we didn't draw any links in those reports. They're very distinct reports, but you do raise a very important matter in that Indigenous communities and Indigenous people are often experiencing homelessness, are displaced more often by natural disasters. In fact, we actually put a case study in our audit report about doing differently. And that's something I think Indigenous Services Canada really does have to approach in collaboration with First Nations community. There was a community that decided, instead of leaving during flooding, they requested funding to move to higher ground, their traditional hunting grounds, and were able to stay on their lands and were able to keep their culture alive instead of being displaced and moved to other communities. So it's solutions like that that are reached in collaboration with communities would help them in the emergency situation. When it comes to homelessness, honestly, I think it's just a much better coordination that needs to be had here. No matter what the vulnerable group is, they have different needs, but you need to know whether or not you're addressing their needs with your actions, and that's where the government was falling short.
Najud?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, as your role as the Auditor General, is this frustrating? Because, this report, at least for the homelessness report, you're supposed to look at whether the government's actually reducing homelessness, and you're not able to do that because the conclusion is that the government doesn't know. So, just in terms of you doing your job, is it frustrating that there's this trend, that there's no data?
I think the most frustrating element for me is that many of the issues we identify here, better support and prevention for Indigenous communities, gathering the information to demonstrate that you're getting value for money, are not new issues that we've raised. Dealing with the gaps and the aging of equipment for the Arctic is, again, not new. The fact that concrete action, there's very little concrete action, is possibly the most frustrating thing in that departments know. And so why aren't they taking the actions needed in order to make the lives of Canadians better? And I'll continue to do my job. News reporters, you should continue to do your job. Parliamentarians need to continue to do that. And collectively, hopefully, we will drive some change that will improve the lives of Canadians.
Christian?
Un peu dans la même veine.
In the same topic as mentioned by my colleague, when the Liberal government was elected, promised to have a government based on results. Now they don't have the data to show the results. So again, as the Auditor General, to what extent do you find this frustrating, and is this a failure of the government? It is frustrating because the program of having for people to have housing to reduce chronic homelessness, it is based on the data. So you need an approach based on the data, and it is very frustrating to not have this approach elsewhere. So in all the analysis I carry out as the Auditor General, if there's no analysis done, I try to do the analysis to provide the information to improve the management of data across the government. But this is, of course, something that needs to be fixed soon. so that we are able to have the right programs and the right supports for Canadians.
Thank you so much, Minister Algabra. Hello, everyone. I want to begin by saying that I also welcome the findings and the recommendations of this report. And let me be absolutely clear. We as a government continue to believe that everyone in Canada has the right to a safe and affordable place to call home that meets their needs. Though we've made progress, we must continue to be unrelenting in our efforts to end chronic homelessness in Canada once and for all, and that means continuing to speed up data collection, analysis, reporting, and improving accountability. In saying this, the Government of Canada recently launched the results reporting online system to help capture data on chronic homelessness, and the system is being strengthened. To add to this, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation and Infrastructure Canada will work together with departments to improve accountability as we continue to prevent and reduce and eventually eliminate chronic homelessness. Reaching Home, Canada's homelessness strategy, has made an impact, and I can think about how, for example, it's helped the Ally Centre in Nova Scotia, Sydney, Nova Scotia, extend its hours to even help more people. This is among many, many organizations that have used this program to help prevent over 62,000 people from becoming homeless and house an additional 32,000 others who are in fact experiencing homelessness. So there is more work to be done. We will continue to work towards ending chronic homelessness together with our partners across the country, and I look forward to implementing all the recommendations of the Auditor General.
And Minister Hussain, actually, if I may have a follow-up. We're hearing today as well that Infrastructure Canada and CMHC have spent billions trying to fight chronic homelessness, and yet we don't seem to have any data to show whether or not those billions are having the impact that you hope that they will have. So how do you explain such an obvious data gap?
Through Reaching Home, we've helped numerous organizations across the country to prevent thousands of people from actually entering homelessness, and then tens of thousands more to actually exit homelessness and find permanent housing. But we know that there's more work to be done, and I commit I thank the Auditor General for their performance audit of the programs to tackle chronic homelessness, and we are committed to implementing all the recommendations.
The report says that they're not sufficiently cooperating, and as my colleague said here, are not even aware of what the outcomes are of their investments. Are you going to be asking for improvements?
Absolutely. The Reaching Home was launched in 2019, and soon after the pandemic hit, and we were working with community groups who were facing the unprecedented challenge of dealing with the pandemic and the additional challenges that created with an already challenging situation. And so at the time, they had difficulties in terms of collecting the data, analyzing it, and reporting it back to us. And so that had an impact on the program. But our government and the community entities are working together to make sure that we not only collect better data, but also analyze it and report it back to the federal government. At the time, the focus was on making sure that people could weather the storm, and that we prevented folks from entering homelessness, and those who were in shelters would have access to more space, social distancing, more beds, access to PPE and other necessary things that needed to happen at the time, and that's what most of the money went to. The reporting was challenging for them, but ever since we've implemented measures to make sure that we have better reporting.
You've been spending billions of dollars to find homelessness, and you don't even have the data to know if it works or not, if it's getting better or worse. Why are you not more apologetic about this?
We do have some data. We know that we prevented 64,000 people from entering homelessness, and we know that data because the community entities actually reported that back to us. And if I can just finish, we also helped house permanently 32,000 people who were experiencing homelessness through the pandemic. And then through the Rapid Housing Initiative, which we launched in 2020, we know how many permanently affordable, rapidly built housing units that have been produced since then, 10,250. And due to the announcement that I made on Thursday for the third round, we will produce another at least 4,500 units. So that is a total of over we have to do a better job, as I said, collecting the data. We have recently launched the results reporting online system. This will help provide better tools and more flexible tools to community entities to report the data, to collect it, and to analyze it. And we launched that first phase this year, and the second phase in November 2022. This will help shape the program, allow us to have more granular data. But absolutely, these programs are having an impact, and I've given you some of those numbers, and I can give you even more. The fact of the matter is we need to do better in terms of the collection and the analysis, yes, and that part of that depends on the community entities, and they were facing the challenges of COVID, and we understand. And so now, with hopefully coming out of the pandemic, the entities will be in a better situation to provide us with more granular data to report back to Canadians. But we will, of course, implement all the recommendations of the Auditor
As
General.
the housing minister, you're aware of your own government's target of reducing homelessness by 50%, right? So you set a number target for yourself.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering, as minister, were you at no point asking your department, hey, I'd like an update, where are we at? Are we...
Of course, absolutely. But as I said, at the time, when this program was launched in 2019, soon after that, COVID hit us, and the community entities were faced with the challenge of really stepping up to collect this data while dealing with preventing homelessness and also finding ways to handle the populations that were experiencing homelessness, to procure more space for them, to procure more PPE, to procure more beds. Their focus of these community entities, 64 community entities across the country, 1,000 organizations helped through this program every year. Their focus was on getting people to weather the storm and get them through COVID so that we didn't have outbreaks in shelters and in transitional homes. And I think by and large they've succeeded, and we increased the Reaching Home dollars precisely to help them do that, and launched the Rapid Housing Initiative so that people can have access to permanent housing. Now that they've done that part, we need to work with them to provide them the tools necessary so that they can report those that feedback to us in terms of how many people on a granular level are being helped by the services.
But the Auditor General said that this is an issue across the government, that it's not just when it comes to chronic homelessness, that there's no data, and so she can't assess what the government's doing and how well it's doing what it promises to do. So given the ambitious goals that this government sets for itself, you know, how do you expect Canadians to trust that you're able to deliver on anything?
Well, Canadians can, I disagree with the premise of your question. We have some data. We don't have as granular data that we would like, and we are working on it through the results and the reporting mechanisms that we've put in place now. So we're already implementing some of the recommendations from the Auditor General. But the fact of the matter is we prevented 64,000 people through our programming in COVID to not experience homelessness. And we housed permanently another 32,000 people who were experiencing homelessness. And through the Rapid Housing Initiative, I can tell you the exact number of units that we've created, which target the most vulnerable people in our society, those experiencing homelessness and those who are at risk of experiencing homelessness. That is a program that has far exceeded its targets, and that is why we've continued with the third round. But absolutely, there's more work to be done, and we will implement the recommendations to make sure that we have better data and better reporting and better collection by providing the community entities the tools that they need to do exactly that. Thank you.